Crawfordsburn Country Park is not the typical place people picture when they think of ghosts. With breathtaking panoramic views, this tranquil park is located on the coast between Bangor and Holywood. The park offers serenity and a feeling of harmony to most who come here. The beaches, along with the dazzling scenery, create an organic retreat for any who care to visit. The eye-catching views traverse the park, stretching all the way across Belfast Loch. But despite its beauty, Crawfordsburn Country Park is steeped in darkness. There used to be caretakers who lived in the old, abandoned Crawfordsburn House 24 hours a day, there to care for the land and the derelict homes still sitting on it at the time, and they had stories. Strange animalistic sounds screamed at them through the trees, day or night. Disembodied voices called their names through the wooded glens. Doors slammed shut and dark figures hovered over their beds in the dead of night. Crawfordsburn House was originally built in 1836 by the Wilson family. Beside Crawfordsburn House, there was a second, older home, referred to now as Crawfordsburn Castle. The castle was converted into stables after the house was built in 1836 and fell into disrepair. At the beginning of the 20th century, the original Wilson homes all passed to another prominent family, the Crawfords, after a Wilson daughter married a Crawford son. It was soon after this marriage that anyone associated with these homes was plagued with illness and death. The Wilson-Crawford marriage was a bad one, ending in separation. Mrs. Wilson-Crawford moved to France. Within days of arriving, she was found dead. Upon her death, her ex-husband sold part of the house and some of the land to the Department of Health. Not long after the sale, her ex-husband died as well, the result of a motorcycling accident that occurred on the road leading up to the house. The couple had no heirs, so the house and land were passed on to the Department of Health. In 1950, the Department of Health converted it into a TB hospital for children. Many unfortunate children died here, so many that in the 1960s two other structures were built on the land, a chapel and a morgue. With the decline of TB in the 1970s, the house was converted into a retirement home and remained as such until 1986, when it was closed. The house stood empty for years before finally being sold to developers who planned to modernize the building and make it into a hotel, but their plans did not get very far. One of their wives came down with a serious illness after the proposals were publicized. Another developer died soon after acquiring the property. Today, the building stands as converted apartments overlooking Crawfordsburn Country Park. Not many living there are aware of its dark history. The dark stories do not end with the derelict homes. Creatures such as hedgehogs, rabbits, badgers, herons, and more can be seen on a daily basis walking along the coastal path of the park. Most of the animals living within Crawfordsburn Country Park are harmless. They are the types of critters that children see and want to pet. The types that make mothers and fathers smile with tenderness. But there is another type of creature lurking in the park. A creature that is not nearly as fond of daylight and visitors as some of the other, more well-known animals it lives amongst. This creature thrives on fear. It will watch and wait, making itself known only when it chooses to. If you are walking your dog in the park, be extra careful, for this creature seems to hate our canine companions. Consider yourself warned. Be careful walking through the peaceful setting of this park. You may not be as safe as you think. Here are the stories of some who entered the park with the expectation of a happy, tranquil day and left terrified. I was walking my dog in Crawfordsburn Country Park. It wasn't terribly late, but it was already starting to get dark. That happens at this time of year. The sky grows dark earlier than you expect. But the cold hadn't set in yet. It was a nice day and I didn't know how many more nice days I would have, so I decided to walk up to the waterfall. It's quiet here. The air is clean and still, and you can sit for hours without encountering another soul. The place is just that big. It's just peaceful, at least ... it was until this day. There wasn't anyone else around, so I let Rosie, my 4-year-old Labrador, off her leash. She ran ahead of me and I hurried after her, not wanting to let her out of my sight. There are some steep drop-offs around here, and if you're running too fast you could fall right over the edge. I rounded a corner and relaxed when I saw that Rosie had stopped, until I realized that she was growling. It wasn't the same type of growl she made when she met another dog she didn't like. This was different. It was laced with anger and fear. And it was all directed at some ordinary-looking bushes. "Come on, Rosie," I called, but she wouldn't move. She just stood there, her tail straight up in the air, her back hunched. I thought maybe she'd caught a whiff of a badger or a rabbit, but no animal had ever made her act like this before. Her teeth gleamed a bright white in the dim light, which was now fading faster by the second. "Come on, Rosie," I said again, starting to get scared now. Goose pimples broke out on my arms. Something wasn't right. The air began to change. It was suddenly colder than it had been just a moment before. A strange sound erupted from the bushes, like a hiss, as if someone had just let air out of a tire. Rosie began to bark and I moved to grab her. That was when I finally saw it. I don't know how to describe it, except as a gnome. It was standing about 10 feet away from us. It was about 3 feet tall and very dark. I don't mean its skin, which was pale and kind of greasy looking. I mean it emanated a strange, negative energy. I could feel it in the air. I could smell it, like rotting meat. I tried to convince myself that it was just a child in a fancy dress, but then I noticed its teeth. They were razor sharp and a horrible brown color. It had a red, bulbous nose and large, deep-set eyes. It smiled at me, purposefully exposing every point of those tiny, razor teeth. Then the gnome began to laugh. This wasn't a regular laugh, but a deep cackle. It bubbled out of him, thick and evil, hurting my ears. I was terrified and frozen to the spot. Its eyes were dark, almost black, and they were huge. I watched as it walked into some bushes by the waterfall and disappeared. I quickly grabbed Rosie before she could chase after it and got her back on her leash. We ran back to my car and left. I'm still having nightmares about that thing and can still hear its laugh. I was showing a young couple around the Crawfordsburn building. They were considering buying a flat in it after the house was converted. Most of the caretakers had moved out by this point, so the place was deserted. The couple went into this room, where a light fitting had smashed to the floor not long ago, to admire an ornate fireplace. It was the middle of the afternoon, and light streamed in through the windows. It was bright and warm. I'd lived here for over a year and knew the place had a history, but I didn't want to tell that to these young people and scare them off. We stood in the room, looking at the fireplace, when a shadow swept across the room, blocking out the sun. The room turned pitch black. It lasted only a moment, but it was enough to get our attention. "What was that?" The woman asked. "Nothing," her husband said, "probably a bird." She looked at him unconvinced. I didn't blame her. It would have had to have been one heck of a big bird outside the window to make the entire room go dark like that. Suddenly, the room turned cold. The birds and crickets stopped chirping. The wind stopped blowing. There were no sounds of life around us except for our own breathing. "What's happening?" the woman asked. I could hear the nervousness in her voice, but her husband was one of these guys who always had to act tough. "Nothing." "Come here and look at this carving on the fireplace," he said, pretending not to notice that we could see our breath in the air now. The light from outside was still shining in at us, but it was like it wasn't reaching us. I don't know how else to describe it, except to say that the warmth of the sun was getting blocked by some invisible shield that was surrounding us. The harder we tried to ignore it, the more obvious it became. The woman suddenly jumped and looked behind her. What was that? She asked. Her husband was starting to look nervous now too. What? He asked. I just stood there trying not to move. I felt something. Did you ... Did one of you just touch me? She asked, looking from her husband to me. We both shook our heads. Someone touched my shoulder, she said, her eyes widening. It's just your imagination. Her husband said, I don't care what it is, let's get out of here. Suddenly there were loud, clearly defined footsteps. They echoed through the hall leading to the room we were in. They got louder as they got closer, then quickly turned, entering the room. Then they just stopped. We all sensed someone watching us. I could feel their eyes on the back of my neck. Oh my God, the woman suddenly cried, pointing one shaky finger to the corner of the room opposite the fireplace. Her husband and I turned, and what we saw still haunts me to this day. A strange mist was forming. It started out a lot like smoke. It had that sort of ethereal quality that things like that have. But the longer we watched, the more solid it became. A face began to take shape. I could make out two eye sockets, but no eyes. They were just black pits. The vague outline of a nose was there, but it was abnormally small for a human. The hands and torso were misshapen, like a body that had been bent and twisted in all the wrong directions, then stuck that way permanently. The woman screamed. The guy was freaking out now. He'd finally had enough and dropped his tough guy persona. He grabbed his wife's hand and hightailed it out of there. I ran after them. They jumped in their car and drove off without saying goodbye. I got in my truck and went back to the main road where I knew I wouldn't be alone. That was the last time I ever stepped foot in Crawfordsburn House. I was driving my work van towards the old hospital one day when Mary flagged me down, just off the road from beside the old inn. I recognized her right away. She was a local and used to walk her dogs here all the time, usually in the early morning. We were on pretty friendly terms and often stopped to chat. This particular morning, she came up to me, her face as white as a ghost. Are you all right? She asked. I didn't know what she was talking about. Fine. Why? I saw that nurse going into Crawfordsburn. I thought maybe something had happened to you. I remembered you said it was just gonna be you and Bill up here alone for a few days. We're both fine, I told her. Mary ... What nurse are you talking about? She shrugged, relaxing a bit now that she knew I was okay. I don't know. She was a nurse, you know, white uniform, medical bag. She had red hair. She stopped and stared at me a minute, her jaw dropping open as she realized what she'd just said. The breeze that had been blowing through the wooded glen suddenly stopped. The air was warm, but a chill quickly ran up my spine. We both turned and stared in the direction of the house. We could see it from the path where we stood. It was old and weathered, despite the caretakers living in it. Somehow, we just never seemed able to keep up with the pace at which it was falling apart. It sat amongst the trees, a dark thorn in an otherwise beautiful and serene setting. Sometimes, especially at night, I could swear the house pulsed like a heartbeat. There were a few dozen ghost stories about Crawfordsburn, a lot of them only the caretakers knew. But there was one everyone knew, the story of a red-headed nurse. Mr. Crawford, who used to own the house, was injured in a motorbike accident on the very road where Mary and I now stood. His staff brought him inside, and a red-headed nurse was brought in to look after him. She stayed for weeks. She and Mr. Crawford grew close. How close, no one can say for sure. Eventually, Mr. Crawford died as a result of his injuries, but the nurse who had looked after him refused to leave. You sure it was her? I asked Mary. She nodded, clearly shaken now. Her dogs were barking, going wild. I went up to her and asked if everything was all right. You spoke to her. I asked. I'd never heard of anyone speaking to the nurse before. What happened? Mary's face was bone white. She had to take a deep breath and hold it before she could answer me. She said ... She said was looking for Mr. Crawford and asked that if I saw him, to let him know she would be here ... waiting.